Thank you, Madam President. I want to talk today, Madam President, about two subjects briefly. The first is sexual harassment. And more specifically, I want to talk about a bill that I'm going to be introducing. It's about the abuse of non-disclosure agreements across government. There are victims of sexual harassment, Madam President, who are prohibited from talking about their experiences because a non-disclosure agreement is attached to a settlement that has been paid for by taxpayers or in some cases with private funds. Victims are silenced. Victims are silenced so voters can't find out about this disgusting behavior. I've always believed, Madam President, that sunlight is the best antiseptic and the best disinfectant, and it's long past time, in my opinion, that we stop re-victimizing people who wanted nothing more than to come to work every day and be treated with basic human dignity. The title of my proposed law, Madam President, is the Stop Silencing Victims Act. And it's really very simple. It would say that if you're a state or federal employee, if you're a public official or a public employee, and you are accused of sexual harassment, and you settle that lawsuit, whether you settle it with taxpayer funds or private funds, then a non-disclosure agreement is prohibited in that settlement unless the victim wants to have a non-disclosure agreement. So in other words, if you're accused of sexual harassment and you settle the case, the taxpayers are entitled to know about the settlement unless the victim decides otherwise. Now, I want to be careful here, Madam President. We believe passionately, as we should, in due process in America. Just because you're accused of something doesn't mean you're guilty of it. Some of my colleagues have suggested in the past that you're morally tainted if you don't automatically believe all accusers. I don't agree with that. I think you're morally tainted if you don't treat both the accusers and the accused with respect and dignity and due process. So the purpose of my bill is not to take away anybody's due process. Just because you're accused of something doesn't mean you're guilty of it. Having said that, Madam President, I think we have to face the facts in America. And we have had far too many instances of sexual harassment. We've seen it in Hollywood repeatedly. I don't know how the actors in Hollywood have time to make movies. They're too busy molesting each other. But it's not just in Hollywood. It's all across society. It's in the halls of Congress. It's in the halls of state government. It's in the boardroom. It is all across America. And for the first time in a long time, women, who are usually, not always, but usually the victims of the sexual harassment, have started to speak up. And I want to thank them for that. My bill will further enhance their voice. So if they make an accusation of sexual harassment and the alleged perpetrator is a state employee or a federal employee and the lawsuit is settled, no longer will you be able to have an agreement that says nobody can talk about it unless the victim wants to. Once again, I think this kind of transparency will help us fight a very serious problem in America, because this is no country for creepy old men or for creepy young men or for creepy middle-aged men or for anybody, man or woman, who would use his or her power to obtain sexual favors from somebody inferior to them in power in the workplace or otherwise. I want to say a word about immigration. Madam President, I believe that presidents, any president, is entitled to surround himself with advisors of his choice. I firmly believe that. As you know, our recent Secretary of Homeland Security has been replaced. She and the President met on Sunday, and they mutually decided that there would be a change at the top in Homeland Security. Secretary Nielsen decided to resign. Shortly thereafter, her White House colleagues, her friends, the people that she has worked with day in and day out to try to solve this crisis of illegal immigration into America, immediately became anonymous sources and proceeded to cut her to pieces off the record. And of course, our press, as it is entitled to do under the First Amendment, feasted on it. Feasted on it. These were Secretary Nielsen's colleagues, the people that she worked with on a daily basis. And this is America. Within reason, you can say what you want, but you ought to put your name to it. You shouldn't hide behind the label of an anonymous source. I believe, Madam President, and I suspect you do too, that we should treat people with dignity and respect. And I felt and still feel that Secretary Nielsen's former colleagues did not show her dignity and respect. In fact, their behavior was classless. I think Secretary Nielsen did the very best she could under difficult circumstances, Madam President. We do have a problem at the border. Problem is an understatement. In March, we had 100,000 people come into our country illegally. 100,000. That's the most in 10 years. If that continues, we're going to set a record this year for people entering our country illegally. Now, we're a nation of immigrants, and I'm proud of that. Americans cannot be called anti-immigrant. We welcome every year 1 million people across the world to become Americans, to come into our country. They do it legally. They follow the law. They're properly vetted. They get in line. They wait patiently, and we welcome them in. We're a nation of immigrants, and I'm very proud of that. Unfortunately, we have another 500,000 to 600,000 people who don't follow the rules. They come into our country illegally. Illegal immigration is illegal. Even if you think it's a good idea, and I don't, if you care about the rule of law, which is one of the bedrock principles in America, then you would want to stop the illegal immigration. It's just that simple. I don't care who the president puts in charge of Homeland Security, and I don't want to leave that statement in isolation or allow it to be taken out of context. Obviously, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security is a very important post, but I don't care what man or woman the president chooses. We're not going to solve this problem until we do three things. Some brand new, shiny, magical wonder pony is not going to gallop in and save us here. We've got to solve this problem ourselves. First thing we have to do is build a wall. I'm not talking about a wall from sea to shining sea. We have 1,900 miles of border. I'm talking about barriers strategically placed. You cannot seal a 1,900-mile piece of real estate without a barrier. It can't be done. If you don't believe me, ask Israel. That's why it has a 400-plus mile border wall with the West Bank. That's why Saudi Arabia has a border wall with Yemen. That's why India has a border wall, and Bulgaria, and Malaysia, and I could keep going. Border walls work. All border walls say is if you come into our country, come in legally, because we believe in the rule of law. The second thing we need to do, Madam President, as you well know, is to pass asylum laws that look like somebody designed the things on purpose. Because what we have now doesn't fit that description. If you're coming from Central America, from El Salvador, from Nicaragua, from Guatemala, all you have to do is make it to American soil, say the magic words, and then you're allowed into our country. You're told, we're going to give you a court date. We're so far behind in our immigration courts, that court date likely will come in a year and a half or 2 years. And you're released into the country. And you're told, come on back for your court date. Some do. Many don't. No other country that I'm aware of, Madam President, has an asylum law as upside down as ours. You could drive across Washington, D.C., and pick the first person you find living under the interstate and say, you draft an asylum law for us, and it would be better than the asylum law we have right now. And this United States Senate ought to be debating America's asylum laws right this second. I'm not saying the other things we're doing, we are in the personnel business, aren't important. But there's not a single issue right now that's more important. And this Congress needs to do its job. The Senate ought to be debating this issue right now. I don't know how it would turn out. How about we surprise ourselves for a change and do something intelligent and put the issue on the floor of the Senate and let us debate it and let us offer amendments, and we might be surprised at what we can achieve. The third thing we're going to have to do to solve our problem, Madam President, is to convince Mexico, our friends in Mexico, our friends in Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, to work with us in terms of solving this problem. And what I'd like to see the president do is call an immigration summit. Now he has declined to do that, but I'm going to keep talking about it until I can try to persuade him. To call an immigration summit, invite the president of Mexico and the president of the Northern Triangle Central American countries. Let's come together and talk about the problem. There's some bad people coming across the border. Some of them are from Central America. The president's right about that. We have gang members. We have drug dealers. We have criminals. We have child sex traffickers. We have adult sex traffickers. But all the people coming across are not bad people. They're coming because they're scared. I read an analysis done the other day, Madam President. It was done by Vanderbilt University. They conducted a poll. And it was the most expensive, thorough poll that you can do. They didn't call people on the telephone. They talked to people in person. Representative sample. And this poll found that between a third and half of the people that they talked to living in Central American countries, the so-called Northern Triangle countries, had been victims of crime within the past year, usually extortion. And that is the problem in these Central American countries. The gangs are running the countries. And in many cases, the police and the elected leadership are complicit. I mean, imagine how bad things would have to be for you to take your child and your spouse and decide, I'm going to leave where I am and walk with the clothes on my back 500, 1,000 miles to another country, because that's how bad things are where I am right now. And that's the case with many of the people in Central America. I don't know the answer, but I think we should start with a presidential summit, not a representative of the presidents, but a presidential summit of the President of the United States, the President of Mexico, President Lopez Obrador, and the presidents of the Northern Triangle countries, and let's see what we can do to solve this problem. There is precedent for this. Back in the late 1990s, well into the next decade, we had a terrible problem with drug cartels and cocaine coming into this country from Colombia. Now, we didn't solve that problem overnight. We solved it by working with Colombia, developing what we call then Plan Colombia. And we sat down with the President of Colombia and said, we will work with you. We'll even provide some of the funding in return for specific commitments. Stop growing cocoa leaves, for example. It took a decade, and we haven't completely solved the problem. But if you visit Colombia today, it's a different country. Let me say it again, Madam President, and I'll end on this note. I'm not anti-immigration, and I don't think most Americans are. We are a nation of immigrants. But illegal immigration undermines legal immigration. Some of my colleagues don't agree with that. They don't make a distinction between legal and illegal immigration. Some of my colleagues, I'm convinced, it's their right. This is America. You can believe what you want. They believe that illegal immigration is a moral good. I don't. I think illegal immigration is illegal, and I think it hurts our country. But we're not going to solve this problem until we control the flow of people from Central America, until we revise our asylum laws, and until we build a barrier. Thank you, Madam President. I suggest the absence of a quorum.